What if the moon is not what we think it is? What if it's not just a natural satellite orbiting Earth, but something placed, something designed, something watching? Every night it rises, silent, unchanging, always there. It does not flicker like the stars. It does not move freely like planets. It follows a precise path, a perfect rhythm. So perfect that ancient civilizations built entire calendars around it. But what if that precision is not accidental? What if it was engineered? Because when scientists studied the moon, they discovered something strange, something that doesn't fully fit with what we expect from a natural object. The size of the moon is almost exactly right to perfectly cover the sun during an eclipse. Not slightly bigger, not slightly smaller, perfect. A coincidence so precise that it seems almost impossible. But that's only the beginning. The moon is also unusually large for a planet like Earth. In fact, compared to other planets, Earth's moon is enormous, almost as if it doesn't belong. And then there is something even more strange. We only ever see one side of the moon, always the same face. It never turns, never reveals what lies on the other side. This is called tidal locking, but the precision of it raises questions because it is perfectly synchronized, like a system that was calibrated, not random, aligned. And when we look deeper into its structure, the mystery grows, because the moon does not behave like solid rock. During seismic experiments, NASA discovered something unusual. When impacts occurred, the moon didn't just absorb the shock. It rang like a bell, vibrating for long periods of time, as if it were hollow or structured differently than expected. A natural object does not usually behave like that, but something engineered might. And then there are the origins. Scientists still debate how the moon was formed. The most accepted theory is that a massive collision created it. But even that theory has gaps, unanswered questions, missing explanations, because the composition of the moon does not perfectly match Earth, nor does it fully match what we would expect from such a collision. And so the mystery remains. Was it formed naturally, or was it placed? Because some theories suggest something far more radical, that the moon could be artificial, a structure, a station, a monitoring system, watching Earth from above, observing, recording, perhaps even influencing. And if that were true, then the question changes. It is no longer about what the moon is, but who put it there, and why. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more.
And if the moon is more than it appears, then everything we think we know about it begins to change. Because for something to be placed, it would need a purpose, a function, a reason to exist. And that raises a quiet question. What would the moon be used for if it were not natural? Some researchers believe it could act as a stabilizer, controlling Earth's rotation, balancing the tilt of the planet, regulating the oceans. The tides rise and fall with perfect consistency, guided by the moon's gravity. Without it, Earth's environment would be far less stable. Life itself might not exist in the way we know it. So what if the moon was not just placed, but placed with intention, to create balance, to maintain conditions, to make Earth habitable? But that is only one possibility, because others suggest something different, something far more unsettling, that the moon is not just stabilizing, but observing, watching from a distance, always present, always silent, and always facing us. because we never see its far side, not from Earth. That side remained hidden for all of human history until modern technology finally revealed it. A landscape completely different, more cratered, more irregular, less familiar, almost like another world. And even now, we know far less about it than we do about the side we see. And that imbalance creates another layer of mystery. Because if something were placed, it would not need to reveal everything, only what is necessary, only what can be seen. And that thought leads us to something deeper. Because throughout history, the moon has always been there. Ancient civilizations wrote about it, studied it, tracked it. The ancient Egypt aligned rituals with it. The Maya civilization built calendars around it. And across the world, cultures separated by oceans all gave it meaning. But some ancient records hint at something unusual. Stories of a time before the moon, a sky that looked different, a world without its constant presence. Are these just myths or fragments of something forgotten? Because if the moon appeared after Earth was already formed, then its origin becomes even more mysterious, and its purpose even more important. Because placing something on that scale would require intelligence, technology, and intention, not random chance, not natural formation, but design. And if something designed it, then it may not just be a satellite, it may be a system, a structure, part of something larger. And that brings us to another possibility. What if the moon is not acting alone? What if it is part of a network, a system of observation, positioned perfectly to monitor Earth, to track movement, to observe changes, to watch continuously? Because from its position, the moon has a perfect view of oceans, of continents, of the entire planet, and it has had that view for as long as humanity can remember, uninterrupted, constant, silent. And that silence may be the most mysterious part, because if something is watching, it does not need to announce itself, it only needs to remain, hidden, consistent, always there. And the moon fits that description perfectly.
And the longer you think about it, the more the questions begin to shift. Because it is no longer just about the moon itself, but about its precision, its position, its consistency. Because everything about it feels exact, not approximate, not random, but calculated. The distance between Earth and the moon, just far enough to stabilize, but not so far that its influence weakens. Its size in the sky almost identical to the sun, allowing total solar eclipses, one of the rarest and most precise alignments in nature. And yet, on Earth, they happen again and again. Perfect alignment, perfect timing, perfect geometry. And in a universe filled with randomness, that level of precision raises questions. Because coincidence can explain many things, but when coincidences begin to stack, when patterns begin to repeat, when precision appears again and again, it begins to feel like something else, something intentional, something designed. And then there is its surface, covered in craters, marked by impacts, silent evidence of collisions over time. But despite those impacts, the moon remains stable, unbroken, intact, almost as if it was built to endure. Because a fragile object would not survive that level of impact, but something reinforced, something structured, might. And that idea has led to one of the most controversial theories,
that beneath the surface of the moon, there could be more. Not just rock, not just dust, but internal structure, layers, possibly even cavities, spaces that we cannot easily see. And if that were true, then the moon would not just be a surface, it would be a shell containing something inside. And that possibility changes everything, because a hollow structure is not natural. It is constructed, designed, engineered. And even though this idea remains unproven, it continues to appear in discussions, in theories, in quiet questions, because the behavior of the moon does not always match expectations. Its density, its composition, its response to impact, all contain small anomalies, small differences that don't fully align with simple explanations. And those small differences add up, they build, they accumulate, until the question becomes unavoidable. Not whether the moon is mysterious, but how deep that mystery goes. Because if even a fraction of these ideas were true, then the moon is not just part of our sky, it is part of something larger, something intentional, something placed. And that brings us to one final layer of thought. Because if the moon is watching, if it is observing, if it has been there for thousands of years, then everything that has happened on Earth, every civilization, every moment in history, has taken place under its view, unseen, unacknowledged, but always present. And that thought changes the feeling completely, because it turns the moon from something distant into something aware, not in a human sense, but in a functional one, a system, a presence, a constant observer. And even if that idea feels distant or impossible, it remains, because once a question like this is asked, it does not disappear. It stays, quietly, in the background, waiting.
And as the idea settles, it becomes less about proving anything and more about observing. Because sometimes the most important questions are not the ones we answer, but the ones we continue to carry. The moon remains exactly where it has always been, unchanged, unmoving, constant, night after night, year after year. And yet, our understanding of it continues to shift, because what we see is only the surface, a distant image, a reflection of sunlight, a familiar shape in the sky. But beyond that surface, there is distance, there is silence, and there is limitation. Because no matter how advanced we become, we have only touched a small part of it, only visited briefly, only explored fragments. The rest remains, out of reach, unseen, unexperienced. And that distance creates space for possibility, because where knowledge ends, questions begin. And the moon exists exactly in that space, between what we know and what we don't. And maybe that is what makes it so powerful, not as an object, but as a symbol, a constant presence that reminds us that even the most familiar things can still hold mystery, can still hold questions, can still remain partially unknown. Because we look at the moon every night, and yet we do not fully understand it. We measure it, we map it, we study it, but understanding is something deeper, something that goes beyond data, beyond observation, into meaning, into purpose. And that is where the question returns. Not what the moon is made of, not how it moves, but why it is there, why it is positioned exactly where it is, why it behaves exactly as it does, why it aligns so precisely with the sun, why it stabilizes Earth in such a perfect way, why it shows us only one face, and why, after all this time, it still feels unresolved. Because if something is completely understood, it becomes simple, predictable, finished. But the moon does not feel finished. It feels open, unanswered, still holding something just beyond reach. And that feeling has remained throughout history. From the earliest civilizations to the present day, people have looked at the moon and wondered not just what it is, but what it means. And that question has never fully gone away. It has only changed form, from myth to science to theory, but at its core, it remains the same, a quiet curiosity, a persistent thought that something so constant, so precise, so perfectly placed may not be entirely accidental. And whether that idea is true or not, it continues to exist, because the moon itself remains silent, unchanging, and always watching from above.
And the longer you sit with that thought, the quieter everything becomes. Not because there are no more questions, but because the questions themselves no longer demand answers. They simply exist, like the moon, present, constant, unresolved. And in that stillness, something changes. The need to explain begins to fade, replaced by something else. Awareness. A simple recognition that not everything we observe is meant to be fully understood. At least, not yet. Because understanding often follows time, discovery, perspective, and sometimes it arrives much later than the question itself. And maybe we are still early, still at the beginning of understanding something that has always been there, something we have seen countless times, but never truly examined. Because familiarity can hide mystery. What we see every day feels known, even when it isn't. And the moon is the perfect example. Always there, always visible, always part of our lives. And yet, still holding questions that remain open, still existing just beyond full comprehension. And maybe that is what gives it its presence. Not distance, not size, but the fact that it feels complete and incomplete at the same time. A known object with unknown depth. A visible form with invisible meaning. And that contrast creates something unique, a quiet tension between certainty and possibility. Because the more we learn, the more we realize how much remains. And the moon stands as a reminder of that. A constant point in the sky that does not change as quickly as everything else. A reference, a marker, something stable in a world of movement. And stability can sometimes feel like truth, even when questions remain. And so, the moon continues, following its path, maintaining its position, reflecting light into the darkness, as it always has, and as it likely will, far beyond this moment, far beyond this time. And maybe that is the final part of the mystery. Not what it is, not where it came from, but why it feels so perfectly placed, so precisely aligned, so consistently present, as if it belongs, and yet, at the same time, as if it doesn't.
And now, there is nothing more to add. No new detail, no new explanation, only what is already there. The moon, the silence around it, the space between, and the awareness that it remains, unchanged, unaffected, present. There is no movement to follow, no shift to observe, only consistency, a steady presence that does not ask to be understood, only noticed, only seen, night after night, without interruption, without variation. And in that consistency, there is something difficult to ignore. Not because it demands attention, but because it does not need to. It is always there, waiting, not for discovery, not for explanation, but simply existing. And maybe that is where the question remains, not in the details, not in the theories, but in the feeling itself, the quiet sense that something so precise, so perfectly positioned, so constant, may hold more than what is immediately visible. And whether that is true or not, the moon continues, unchanged, unanswered, unresolved, a presence in the sky that does not explain itself, and perhaps never will.
And as everything settles, the question remains, not louder, not clearer, but deeper, more distant, like something just beyond reach. The moon continues, as it always has, unaffected, unchanged, uninterrupted, a constant in the sky that does not respond, does not react, does not reveal, only remains. And in that stillness, there is something unusual, because most things change, they evolve, they shift over time. But this does not. It follows the same path, keeps the same face, maintains the same presence, as if it were fixed, not drifting, not wandering, but placed, held in position, exactly where it needs to be. And that idea does not force itself. It does not demand belief. It simply appears, quietly, as a possibility, one among many. And like all possibilities, it remains open, unresolved, waiting. Because some questions are not meant to be answered quickly. They unfold over time, through observation, through perspective, through curiosity. And maybe this is one of them, a question that does not end, but continues, just like the moon itself, always there, always present, always part of the sky, and always just slightly beyond complete understanding. And what if the reason it feels so precise, so perfectly placed, is because it wasn't made for us? At least, not originally. Imagine, long before recorded history, before the first civilizations, before the first memory, something arrived, not crashing, not destroying, but positioning, carefully, silently, something vast, something intelligent, something that did not need to land because it never intended to touch the earth, only to observe it, to orbit, to remain above everything, watching, waiting, recording. And over time, the surface changed, covered in dust, marked by impacts, aging, blending into what we now call the moon. But beneath that surface, what if something still exists, something structured, something active, not in a way we can easily detect, but in a way that continues, quietly, like a system that never shuts down? And maybe it was never meant to be seen, only to be present, a silent observer in the sky, tracking, monitoring, learning. Because from that distance, everything on Earth is visible. The rise of civilizations, the fall of empires, the movement of oceans, the patterns of life, all of it captured, stored, understood, not by us, but by something else, something that placed itself exactly where it needed to be, to see everything without being seen. And what if the reason we only see one side is not just coincidence, but design, a limitation, a boundary, a controlled perspective? Because if there is more on the other side, it would remain hidden, always, beyond direct view, beyond easy access, protected, not by force, but by distance and silence. And maybe, every time we look at the moon, we are not just observing it, but being observed, not in a way that feels immediate,
not in a way that feels threatening, but in a way that is constant, background, unnoticed, like something that has always been there. And because it has always been there, we stopped questioning it. We accepted it. We called it natural. We called it normal. And we moved on. But what if normal is just something we no longer question? And what if the moon is the perfect example of that? Something so familiar that its true nature remains hidden in plain sight. And somewhere, beyond what we can see, beyond what we can measure, beyond what we can prove, there may be something still active, still present, still watching, not interfering, not revealing itself, only waiting for a moment when it is finally understood, or perhaps when it is no longer meant to remain hidden.
And if something is there, if something has always been there, then the next question is not just what, but when. Because if the moon was placed, it was not placed recently. It has been here long before us, long before the first cities, long before the first language, long before memory itself. Which means whatever placed it is older, far older than humanity, and far more advanced. Because to move something that size, to position it in perfect orbit, to stabilize an entire planet, requires more than technology. It requires understanding of physics, of time, of systems, on a scale we are only beginning to imagine. And maybe it was not just placed. Maybe it was activated, like a system, like a device, like something that was turned on and never turned off. Still running, still functioning, still observing. Because what if the moon is not just an object, but an interface, a connection point between Earth and something beyond it, something distant, something watching from far away, not from the sky, but from somewhere much deeper, somewhere we cannot reach. And the moon is the bridge, a relay, a silent transmitter, receiving, sending, holding information across time. Because if something wanted to observe Earth, it would not need to be here. It would only need a vantage point, a perfect position. And the moon is exactly that, always facing us, always present, always aligned. And maybe that alignment is not just physical, but informational. Because what if the moon is constantly collecting data, not in a way we can easily detect, but in a way that is continuous, subtle, embedded in its structure, encoded in its presence. And over thousands of years, that data grows, layer by layer, moment by moment, a complete record of everything that has ever happened on Earth, stored somewhere within it, hidden, silent, untouched. And maybe there have been moments when we came close to discovering something we didn't fully understand, something that didn't fit. Signals, anomalies, unexplained patterns that appeared briefly and then disappeared, dismissed, forgotten, because they didn't match expectations, because they didn't have easy explanations. And maybe that is how something like this stays hidden, not by force, but by doubt, because anything that seems too unusual is often ignored or explained away. And so the system continues, unnoticed, unquestioned, running quietly in the background of everything we know. And maybe, just maybe, it was never meant to be discovered all at once, but slowly, piece by piece, as understanding grows, as awareness expands, as curiosity returns. Because the moment we begin to question again is the moment we begin to see differently. And once that shift happens, the moon is no longer just the moon. It becomes something else, something deeper, something with purpose, something that has always been there, waiting.
And if something like this exists, if the moon is more than a silent object, then there is one possibility that changes everything: communication. Because observation alone is passive, but communication means interaction, a system that not only watches, but connects. And maybe that connection has already happened. Not recently, not in ways we would recognize today, but long ago, in moments that were never fully understood.
Because throughout history, there have always been stories. Stories of voices from the sky, of lights that move differently, of knowledge that seemed to appear without explanation, given, not discovered. And maybe those moments were not imagination, but fragments, small signals received, interpreted, but never fully understood. Because if something were communicating, it would not use language, at least not our language. It would use patterns, frequencies, signals, things that could pass unnoticed or be mistaken for something else. And maybe they have been, hidden inside noise, hidden inside data, hidden inside the background of everything we measure. Signals that appear, disappear, and are dismissed because they don't repeat in obvious ways, because they don't follow expected patterns, because they don't fit. And yet, they exist. Briefly, quietly, just enough to be noticed, but not enough to be confirmed. And maybe that is intentional, because a clear signal would change everything. But a subtle one, a fragmented one, creates curiosity, creates doubt, keeps the system hidden, while still allowing something to pass through. And if the moon is acting as a relay, then it would not need to transmit constantly, only occasionally, only when needed, only when conditions are right. And maybe those conditions have already occurred more than once. Moments in time when something aligned, when something connected, when something was briefly understood before being lost again. Because understanding something beyond us requires more than observation. It requires readiness. And maybe humanity has not always been ready. Not ready to recognize, not ready to interpret, not ready to accept. And so, the signals remain unclear, unconfirmed, unresolved, but still present, still part of the background, still part of the possibility. And maybe that is how it was designed, not to reveal itself all at once, but to exist in layers, gradually, quietly, until the moment comes when the question is no longer ignored, when curiosity becomes focus, when observation becomes understanding. And when that happens, the moon may no longer feel distant or silent, but connected.
And if signals were sent, if something reached out, then the final piece of the question becomes, did anyone receive them? Because if even a small part of humanity once understood, even briefly, then traces of that understanding might still exist. Not in obvious ways, not in clear records, but in fragments, in symbols, in structures, in ideas that seem too advanced for their time. Because throughout history, there are moments that don't fully fit, knowledge that appears suddenly, precision that seems unexpected, understanding that feels ahead of its era, as if something was remembered rather than discovered. And maybe that memory did not come from within, but from outside, from something that observed, something that watched long enough to understand patterns, to understand life, to understand us, and at some point shared something back. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. Enough to influence, enough to guide, enough to leave a mark. And those marks may still exist, hidden in plain sight. Because if knowledge like that were given, it would not always be understood correctly. It would be interpreted, translated, changed over time, turned into myth, turned into story, turned into belief. And eventually, the original meaning would fade, leaving only fragments behind. Fragments that feel important, but are no longer clear. And maybe that is what we are seeing now. Not the knowledge itself, but what remains of it, scattered, incomplete, waiting to be seen differently. Because sometimes understanding does not come from finding something new, but from looking again at something old with a different perspective. And when that happens, patterns begin to appear, connections begin to form, ideas that once seemed separate start to align.
And slowly, a different picture begins to emerge. Not fully clear, not fully defined, but enough to suggest that something more may have always been there. Something observed, something recorded, something perhaps even guided from above, from the moon, silent, constant, watching across time. And if that is true, then the moon is not just part of our past. It is part of an ongoing process, still active, still present, still connected, even now.
And after everything, after all the questions, all the possibilities, all the thoughts that quietly unfolded, the moon remains exactly where it has always been, silent, distant, unchanged, hanging in the night sky, as if nothing has ever happened, as if nothing has ever been questioned. And yet, everything feels different now, because once a question like this begins, it never truly ends. It stays in the background of your thoughts, quietly, returning every time you look up, every time the night becomes still, every time the moon appears. Because now, it is no longer just light in the sky. It is a presence, a possibility, something that might be more than what it seems. And maybe that is the true nature of the mystery. Not something to be solved, but something to be seen, felt, considered. Because whether the moon is natural or something placed, whether it is silent or observing, whether it is empty or holding something within, one thing remains certain. It is there, every night, without fail, unmoving, unchanging, watching over a world that continues to question. And perhaps that is enough, because not every mystery needs an answer. Some only need awareness. And the next time you step outside and the world becomes quiet and the sky opens above you, look at the moon, not as something familiar, but as something unknown, something distant, something that has been there long before you and will remain there long after. And ask yourself, just once, not out loud, but quietly, in your own thoughts, what if it was never just the moon?